Welcome to another episode of Ever After Romance Audiobook. This story is an original creation for entertainment only. Enjoy!
Prologue. Some love stories begin with meet-cutes in coffee shops. Others start with passionate glances across crowded rooms. But the greatest love story of Emma Sullivan's life began with the most humiliating moment she'd ever experienced, catching her golden boy fiancé with another woman at their engagement party. What she didn't know was that the man who would save her from that devastation had been watching from the shadows for years, waiting for the moment when she'd finally see him, not as her fiancé's dangerous best friend, but as the man who'd been loving her in silence all along.
Chapter 1. The Perfect Life Shattered. The Millbrook Country Club sparkled with the kind of understated elegance that only old money could buy, its crystal chandeliers casting romantic prisms across walls adorned with 3 generations of local society photographs. Emma Sullivan moved through the crowded ballroom with the graceful confidence of someone who'd finally found her place in a world that had always seemed slightly out of reach. Her engagement ring catching the light like captured starfire with each gesture. Tonight was supposed to be perfect, the culmination of a fairy tale romance that had the entire town of Millbrook buzzing with approval. Dr. James Richardson, the golden boy who'd returned home after his prestigious residency, choosing the sweet librarian who'd waited for him with patient devotion through years of long-distance courtship. "Emma, darling, you look absolutely radiant," gushed Mrs. Henderson, the mayor's wife, her approval carrying the weight of social validation that Emma had craved since childhood. "James is such a lucky man. When's the wedding?" "June," Emma replied, with the kind of dreamy smile that belonged to women who believed in happily ever after. "The garden ceremony at the Richardson estate, just like we planned when we were teenagers." The lie felt comfortable on her tongue, though somewhere in the back of her mind, Emma registered that most of their wedding plans had been James's ideas, refined versions of dreams his mother had harbored for decades. Nevertheless, love meant compromise, and Emma had spent so many years learning to fold herself into James's vision of their future that she'd forgotten she'd once had dreams of her own. Moreover, tonight was about celebration, not doubt. The entire town had turned out to toast their engagement, and Emma floated through conversations with the weightless joy of someone who'd finally achieved everything she'd been taught to want. "Have you seen James?" asked Victoria Sinclair, the mayor's daughter, her question delivered with the kind of saccharine sweetness that never quite reached her calculating blue eyes. "I wanted to congratulate him personally." Emma's pulse quickened with unconscious unease as she noticed Victoria's predatory smile, the way her red dress seemed designed to attract masculine attention rather than celebrate someone else's engagement. "He stepped out for some air, I think. You know how he gets claustrophobic at these events." "Oh, yes," Victoria replied, with knowing intimacy that made Emma's stomach clench with sudden suspicion. "James has always needed his space." The comment hung in the air like perfume with an undertone of poison, but before Emma could process its implications, she was swept into another round of congratulations and wedding planning discussions that required her full attention and practiced smile. It wasn't until an hour later, when Emma went searching for James to announce their first dance, that her carefully constructed world began to crumble with devastating precision. The Richardson estate's garden gazebo had been decorated with fairy lights for the occasion, its romantic ambiance designed to showcase the happy couple during their private moments away from the crowd. Instead, Emma found James pressed against the gazebo's far wall, his hands tangled in Victoria's perfectly styled blonde hair, while her red dress pulled around their feet in abandoned passion. The sight hit Emma like physical violence, stealing her breath and freezing her in place as her mind struggled to process the impossibility of what she was witnessing. This was James. Her James. The man who'd promised her forever just 3 months ago. The man who'd convinced her that their love was worth waiting through years of separation and sacrifice. "James?" Emma's voice came out as barely a whisper, but it carried clearly enough to make both figures spring apart with the guilty haste of teenagers caught breaking curfew. "Emma!" James's face flushed crimson as he scrambled to straighten his tuxedo, his usual composed authority replaced by panic that confirmed Emma's worst fears. "This isn't... We were just giving the groom a proper send-off," Victoria interrupted with cruel satisfaction, her lipstick smeared but her confidence intact. "After all, what James and I have goes back much further than his little rebound relationship with the town librarian." The words hit Emma like successive slaps, each revelation more devastating than the last. Rebound relationship, little librarian. Everything she'd believed about their love story dissolved into humiliating reality. She'd been convenient, safe, the kind of woman who waited patiently while more exciting options presented themselves. Furthermore, the way Victoria spoke suggested this wasn't an isolated incident, but part of a pattern Emma had been too trusting to recognize. "Emma, please," James began desperately, reaching toward her with hands that had just been touching another woman. "Let me explain." But Emma was already backing away, her heart hammering against her ribs as the full scope of her humiliation became clear. The entire engagement party was inside, celebrating a love that had apparently been one-sided from the beginning. Everyone in Millbrook would know by morning that sweet Emma Sullivan had been naive enough to believe she could hold the attention of a man like James Richardson. "Don't," Emma said with surprising steadiness, her voice carrying newfound strength despite the devastation crushing her chest. "Don't make this worse by lying to me again." As Emma fled toward the country club's exit, her engagement ring catching the light one final time before she slipped it from her finger, she could hear the party continuing inside. Laughter and music and celebration of a future that had just died in a garden gazebo, decorated with fairy lights and broken dreams. The worst part wasn't even James's betrayal. The worst part was realizing that somewhere deep down, she'd always known she wasn't enough to hold him, and she'd chosen to ignore that knowledge rather than face the truth about their relationship. Now the truth was inescapable, and so was the humiliation that would follow her through every street and shop in Millbrook for the rest of her life. Unless she ran. Unless she left everything behind and started over somewhere no one knew her as the librarian who'd been too stupid to see what everyone else probably already knew. Emma's decision was made before she reached her car. By morning, she'd be gone from Millbrook forever, leaving behind the only home she'd ever known rather than face the pitying looks and whispered gossip that would follow her betrayal. What Emma didn't know was that someone had been watching from the shadows, someone whose heart was breaking for entirely different reasons as he witnessed the destruction of her carefully built happiness. Someone who was about to make her an offer that would change everything if she was brave enough to accept it. Chapter 2. The Unexpected Proposal. The soft glow of Emma's apartment seemed to mock her as she moved through familiar spaces that no longer felt like home, her engagement dress a puddle of silk and shattered dreams on the bedroom floor. 3 boxes sat open on her coffee table, ready to receive the pieces of a life she was preparing to abandon, rather than face the humiliation that would greet her tomorrow, when news of James's betrayal spread through Millbrook like wildfire. Every item she touched carried memories that now felt tainted. The coffee mug James had given her from his hospital gift shop, the books they'd read together during his medical school years, the photo of them at last year's Millbrook Summer Festival, where they'd looked so perfectly happy that strangers had stopped to compliment them on their obvious love. Nevertheless, Emma forced herself to pack with mechanical precision, her tears having dried into the kind of hollow numbness that followed complete emotional devastation. Better to leave with dignity intact than to stay and watch her reputation crumble under the weight of public pity and whispered speculation about what she'd done wrong to lose James Richardson. The knock on her door came at 11:47 p.m., soft enough that Emma almost convinced herself she'd imagined it. She wasn't expecting visitors, certainly not at this hour, and definitely not when her face bore the ravages of heartbreak that no amount of cold cream could disguise. "Emma?" The voice carried through her door with gentle authority that made her pulse quicken with recognition. "It's Ethan. I know you're awake." Ethan Walsh. James's best friend since childhood, business partner in the medical building project, and the man Emma had spent 3 years trying not to notice despite the way his presence seemed to electrify every room he entered. Ethan represented everything James wasn't, rough where James was refined, dangerous where James was safe, working with his hands instead of basking in academic accolades. Furthermore, Ethan had always looked at Emma with an intensity that made her uncomfortable, as if he could see through her carefully constructed facade to secrets she wasn't even aware she was keeping. "Go away, Ethan," Emma called through the door, her voice hoarse from crying. "I'm not receiving visitors tonight." "I know what happened at the party," Ethan replied with quiet conviction that suggested he'd witnessed more than Emma realized. "And I know you're planning to leave town tomorrow morning, that's why I'm here." Emma felt her defensive walls crumbling under the weight of his perception. How did he know about her plans? How long had he been watching her life unfold with the kind of attention she'd never realized she was receiving? Moreover, the fact that he'd come here now suggested motivations that Emma's emotionally exhausted mind couldn't begin to process. Against her better judgment, Emma opened the door to find Ethan leaning against her doorframe with the kind of casual confidence that made expensive suits look like costumes, while his jeans and work shirt somehow managed to convey more authority than James's entire medical degree. His dark hair was mussed as if he'd been running his fingers through it, and his green eyes held depths of concern that transformed his usually intimidating presence into something approaching tenderness. Even in her devastated state, Emma felt her treacherous pulse respond to his proximity with awareness she'd spent years trying to suppress. "You look like hell," Ethan observed with brutal honesty that somehow felt kinder than the false sympathy she'd endure from well-meaning neighbors tomorrow. "Thank you," Emma replied dryly, stepping back to allow him entry into her apartment. That's exactly what every woman wants to hear after discovering her fiancé with another woman. Ethan's jaw tightened with fury that transformed his features into something harder, more dangerous than Emma had ever seen. "James is an idiot," he said with quiet vehemence. "He's always been an idiot, but tonight he proved he's also a bastard who doesn't deserve to breathe the same air as you." The unexpected defense sent warmth flooding through Emma's battered heart, though she tried to maintain emotional distance from comfort offered by her ex-fiancé's best friend. "You don't have to say that. We both know James could have any woman in 3 counties. I was just convenient." "Convenient?" Ethan's laugh held no humor, only disbelief that made Emma wonder what she was missing in his reaction. "Emma, you're the most extraordinary woman in this entire state. If James can't see that, then he's even more of a fool than I thought." Emma stared at Ethan, searching his face for signs of pity or manipulation, finding instead a sincerity that took her breath away. When was the last time someone had looked at her like she was remarkable rather than merely adequate? "Why are you here, Ethan?" Emma asked quietly, her heart racing with possibilities she didn't dare name. "Because you're about to make the biggest mistake of your life," Ethan replied with gentle firmness, moving closer until Emma could smell his cologne, something woodsy and masculine that made her pulse quicken despite every rational thought. "Because running away from Millbrook means letting James and Victoria win, and you're too strong to give them that satisfaction." "I'm not strong," Emma protested weakly, though something in Ethan's conviction made her want to believe him. "I'm the woman who spent 3 years waiting for a man who was never really mine." "You're the woman who built the most successful literacy program in the county," Ethan corrected with quiet intensity. "You're the woman who single-handedly saved the library from budget cuts through pure determination and community organizing. You're the woman who makes this entire town better just by existing in it." Emma felt tears threatening as she processed Ethan's words, recognition dawning that he'd been paying attention to aspects of her life that James had never seemed to notice. "How do you know about the literacy program?" Ethan's smile was soft but secretive, carrying implications that made Emma's heart race with dangerous possibilities. "I know a lot of things about you, Emma Sullivan, things that matter more than James ever realized." Before Emma could process the weight of Ethan's admission, he stepped closer, his hands coming up to frame her face with the kind of reverent care she'd never experienced from James's more casual touches. "Marry me," Ethan said simply, his voice carrying absolute conviction despite the impossibility of what he was proposing. Emma's breath caught as she processed his words, her mind reeling with shock and confusion, and something that felt suspiciously like hope. "What?" "Marry me," Ethan repeated with patient intensity, his thumbs tracing gentle patterns across her cheekbones. "Tomorrow, next week, whenever you're ready. Show this entire town that you don't need James Richardson to be happy. Show them that you deserve someone who sees your worth instead of taking it for granted." "Ethan, that's insane," Emma whispered, though her heart was singing with possibilities she'd never dared imagine. "You're James's best friend. You can't just—" "I can do whatever I want," Ethan interrupted with the kind of quiet authority that had built his construction empire from nothing. "And what I want is to give you the life you deserve, the respect you've earned, and the love you should have been receiving all along." Emma stared into Ethan's eyes, seeing depths of emotion that suggested this wasn't a spontaneous offer born from pity, but something he'd been contemplating for longer than she could imagine. "Why?" Emma asked desperately. "Why would you do this for me?" Ethan's answer came without hesitation. "Because James Richardson is the biggest fool who ever lived, and I'm tired of watching him waste what I'd give anything to have." The confession hung between them like a bridge. Emma wasn't sure she was brave enough to cross, but as she looked into Ethan's face, she saw something that had been missing from her relationship with James. Genuine desire, protective fury, and the kind of devotion that would move mountains rather than demand she climb them alone. "Yes," Emma heard herself saying, the word escaping before rational thought could intervene. "Yes, Ethan Walsh. I'll marry you." As Ethan's mouth curved into the first genuine smile Emma had ever seen from him, she realized that her fairy tale hadn't ended tonight. It had finally begun. Chapter 3. The Wedding Planning. The morning sun streamed through the windows of Murphy's Diner with the kind of golden warmth that made even the most ordinary moments feel touched by magic. But Emma felt anything but magical as she sat across from Ethan, surrounded by wedding planning materials that represented the most impulsive decision she'd ever made in her carefully controlled life. "The courthouse can do the ceremony Friday afternoon," Ethan said, with the practical efficiency that had built his construction business into Millbrook's most successful enterprise. "Judge Morrison owes me a favor, and he's willing to perform the service with minimal notice." Emma nodded, her hands wrapped around her coffee cup like a lifeline, as she tried to process the surreal reality of planning her second engagement in less than 24 hours. "Friday, that's soon." "Too soon?" Ethan asked, his green eyes studying her face with an intensity that made Emma's pulse quicken despite her emotional exhaustion. "We can wait if you need more time to process everything that's happened." "No," Emma said with more conviction than she felt. "No. If we're doing this, we should do it before I lose my nerve, or the entire town convinces me I've lost my mind." Moreover, she could already hear the whispers that would follow her through Millbrook's streets today. Poor Emma Sullivan, so desperate to save face that she'd rebound into marriage with her ex-fiancé's best friend before the ink was dry on yesterday's humiliation. Ethan's hand covered hers on the table, his touch sending electricity through her nervous system in ways that James's contact never had. "Emma, look at me." She raised her eyes to meet his steady gaze, finding strength in his confidence even when her own seemed to be crumbling under the weight of public scrutiny. "This isn't about saving face," Ethan said with quiet conviction, his thumb tracing patterns across her knuckles that made her breath catch. "This is about giving you the life you deserve with someone who recognizes your worth. If anyone in this town has a problem with that, they can answer to me." The protective edge in Ethan's voice sent warmth flooding through Emma's chest, reminding her that she'd never had someone willing to defend her choices with such fierce determination. James had always been more concerned with public opinion than personal loyalty, but Ethan seemed prepared to take on the entire world if it meant protecting her happiness. "Speaking of people with problems," came a familiar voice from the diner's entrance. "I think we need to discuss this ridiculous situation before it goes any further." Emma's stomach dropped as James strode toward their table with the kind of entitled confidence that had once made her heart race with pride. and now made her cringe with embarrassment. His golden hair was perfectly styled despite the early hour, his casual clothes expensive enough to signal his superior social status to anyone who might question his right to interrupt. Furthermore, he moved with the assumption that his presence would be welcomed, as if Emma's engagement to his best friend was merely a misunderstanding he could resolve with charm and persistence. "James," Ethan said with deadly quiet, his entire posture shifting from tender suitor to dangerous protector in the space of a heartbeat. "I don't recall inviting you to join us." "This is insane, Ethan," James continued, as if his best friend hadn't spoken, his attention focused on Emma with the kind of patronizing concern that made her teeth ache. "Emma, sweetheart, I know you're hurt, but marrying Ethan out of spite isn't going to solve anything." Emma felt her temper flare at James's casual dismissal of her decision-making abilities, his assumption that she was incapable of making rational choices without his guidance. "This has nothing to do with spite, James. It has to do with choosing someone who values me enough not to cheat at our engagement party. What happened with Victoria was a mistake," James said with the kind of practiced sincerity that suggested he'd been rehearsing this conversation. "A moment of weakness that meant nothing compared to what we have together." "Had," Emma corrected with steel creeping into her voice. "What we had together. Past tense." "Emma, be reasonable," James continued with increasing desperation, his perfect composure beginning to crack under the weight of losing control over the situation. "You can't marry Ethan. He's not the kind of man who settles down, not the kind of husband you need. He's my best friend, but even I know he's not good enough for someone like you." Ethan rose from his chair with predatory grace, his movement so fluid and threatening that several other diner patrons turned to watch the developing confrontation. "Careful, James," Ethan said with the kind of quiet menace that made smart people step back. "You're about to say something that ruins our friendship permanently." "Our friendship was ruined the moment you decided to take advantage of Emma's emotional vulnerability." James shot back with growing anger. "This is opportunistic, Ethan, and you know it." Emma felt something snap inside her as she listened to James discuss her as if she were property to be negotiated between them, rather than a woman capable of making her own decisions. Rising from her chair with newfound determination, she positioned herself beside Ethan with body language that left no doubt about her allegiances. "The only thing that's opportunistic," Emma said with cold precision, "is you assuming you have any say in my future after what you did last night. Ethan is offering me respect, loyalty, and a partnership based on genuine care. You offered me betrayal disguised as love and expected me to be grateful for the privilege." James's face flushed crimson as the diner's other patrons began paying obvious attention to their conversation, small-town gossip networks activating with the efficiency of emergency broadcasting systems. "This isn't over," James said with quiet fury, his threat directed at Ethan rather than Emma. "She'll realize what a mistake this is, and when she does, you'll have destroyed our friendship for nothing. Our friendship ended when you cheated on the best woman either of us will ever know," Ethan replied with finality that made James step back in recognition of bridges burned beyond repair. "Emma deserves better than you, James. She always has." As James stormed out of the diner with wounded pride and public humiliation, Emma felt Ethan's arm slide around her waist with protective possessiveness that made her pulse race with dangerous awareness. "Are you okay?" Ethan asked softly, his breath warm against her temple as he gathered her close. "I'm better than okay," Emma replied with surprise at her own strength. "For the first time in 3 years, I feel like someone sees me as an equal instead of an accessory." Ethan's smile was soft but triumphant as he looked down at her with eyes that held depths of emotion Emma was only beginning to recognize. "Then let's go plan a wedding that shows this entire town exactly what you deserve." As they left Murphy's diner hand in hand, Emma realized that her impulsive decision to marry Ethan Walsh might be the first truly brave thing she'd ever done, and definitely the first time she'd chosen her own happiness over other people's expectations. The fairy tale she'd thought was ending was actually just beginning, and for the first time in her life, Emma was the author of her own story. Chapter 4. The Fake Honeymoon. Ethan's house sat on 5 acres of carefully maintained property at the edge of Millbrook, its craftsman-style architecture and sprawling front porch suggesting comfort rather than ostentation, despite the obvious quality of every detail. Emma had driven past this place countless times during her relationship with James, but she'd never imagined she'd be crossing its threshold as the new Mrs. Walsh, her hastily packed belongings testament to how dramatically her life had changed in just 48 hours. "Welcome home," Ethan said softly as he carried her suitcase toward the front door, his voice carrying warmth that made the simple phrase feel like a promise rather than mere politeness. Emma felt her breath catch as she took in the details Ethan had clearly arranged for her arrival. Fresh flowers in crystal vases, the scent of something delicious emanating from the kitchen, and an overall atmosphere of preparation that suggested her comfort had been his primary concern. Moreover, the house itself defied every assumption she'd made about Ethan's lifestyle. Where she'd expected bachelor minimalism, she found warmth, character, and evidence of interests that revealed depths to his personality James had never mentioned. "This is beautiful," Emma said honestly, as they entered a living room that managed to be both masculine and welcoming, its leather furniture and exposed beams balanced by carefully chosen artwork and the kind of built-in bookshelves that spoke to someone who actually read for pleasure. "I built most of it myself," Ethan admitted, with the quiet pride of someone who created value with his own hands. "Took 3 years of weekends and evenings, but I wanted something that felt like home instead of just a place to sleep." Emma studied Ethan's face as he spoke, noting the way his eyes softened when he talked about his home, the unconscious love in his voice for something he'd created from nothing. This was a man who understood the difference between building a house and creating a sanctuary, between acquiring possessions and cultivating belonging. Furthermore, she was beginning to realize that everything she thought she knew about Ethan Walsh had been filtered through James's dismissive descriptions of his rough-around-the-edges best friend. "The master bedroom is upstairs," Ethan continued with careful neutrality, his tone suggesting he'd given considerable thought to the logistics of their unusual situation. "But I've set up the guest room for you so you'll have privacy while we figure out how this works." Emma felt heat rise in her cheeks as she processed the implications of Ethan's thoughtfulness. Of course, they needed to discuss sleeping arrangements. Their marriage might be legal, but it was also convenient fiction designed to save her from humiliation rather than consummate a love affair. Nevertheless, the consideration he'd shown for her comfort spoke to a level of emotional intelligence that James had never demonstrated, even during their most intimate moments. "Thank you," Emma said quietly, touched by his respect for boundaries she hadn't even known she needed. "I know this situation is complicated." "Nothing about caring for you is complicated," Ethan replied with simple honesty that made Emma's pulse quicken with dangerous awareness. "Emma, I want you to be comfortable here. This is your home now, for as long as you want it to be." Before Emma could respond to the implications of Ethan's words, the doorbell chimed with the kind of urgent insistence that suggested visitors who wouldn't be easily discouraged. "That'll be James," Ethan said with resignation, his expression hardening as he recognized the pattern of his former best friend's persistent attempts at interference. "He's been calling all morning, demanding to talk to you." Emma felt her stomach clench with anxiety as she prepared to face another confrontation with the man who'd shattered her world less than 48 hours ago. "Maybe I should talk to him. Clear the air. Make sure he understands this is final." "You don't owe him anything," Ethan said with protective fury that transformed his features into something harder, more dangerous than Emma had ever seen. "But if you want to face him, I'll be right beside you." Together, they answered the door to find James standing on the front porch with the kind of desperate determination that suggested he'd been rehearsing this confrontation since leaving the diner that morning. His usually perfect appearance showed signs of strain. Wrinkled clothes, unkempt hair, eyes shadowed with the kind of sleepless desperation that accompanied the loss of something he'd taken for granted. "Emma, please," James began without preamble, his voice carrying the pleading edge of someone who'd finally realized the magnitude of what he'd lost. "I need 5 minutes to explain what really happened, to make you understand that marrying Ethan is a mistake that will destroy all of our lives. I gave you 3 years to explain yourself," Emma replied with strength that surprised all three of them. 3 years of listening to your excuses, your promises, your justifications for why everything was always someone else's fault. "I'm done listening, James." "This isn't you talking," James said with growing desperation, his gaze shifting between Emma and Ethan with obvious suspicion. "Ethan's manipulating you, using your emotional vulnerability to get something he's wanted for years." Emma felt Ethan tense beside her, his protective instincts responding to the implied threat in James's accusation. "What's that supposed to mean?" James's smile was bitter and cruel, carrying implications that made Emma's blood run cold with growing understanding. "Ask your new husband how long he's been in love with you, Emma. Ask him how many times he's watched you from across rooms, how many of your projects he's secretly funded, how many conversations we've had about his inappropriate feelings for my fiancé." The words hit Emma like successive physical blows, forcing her to confront possibilities she'd never allowed herself to consider. Had Ethan's marriage proposal been motivated by genuine care, or by opportunistic desire to claim something he'd coveted while it belonged to someone else? Moreover, the certainty in James's voice suggested knowledge that went beyond speculation, intimate details about Ethan's feelings that could only have come from friendship and confidence. "Is that true?" Emma asked quietly, her voice barely audible as she turned to face Ethan with eyes that demanded absolute honesty. Ethan's jaw tightened as he met her gaze, his expression cycling through anger, resignation, and something that looked suspiciously like relief at finally being allowed to tell the truth. "Yes," Ethan said simply, his voice carrying the weight of years of suppressed emotion. "I've been in love with you since the day James introduced us. Every day for 3 years, I've watched him take for granted what I would have given anything to have." The confession hung in the air between them like a bridge. Emma wasn't sure she was ready to cross, transforming her understanding of every interaction they'd ever shared and every kindness he'd shown her during her relationship with James. "You see?" James said with triumphant vindication, moving closer as if he could physically reclaim what he'd lost through proximity and persistence. "This entire marriage is based on his obsession, not genuine care for your well-being." But as Emma looked into Ethan's eyes, she saw something that had been missing from her relationship with James: vulnerability, honesty, and the kind of love that put her happiness above his own desires. "At least he's honest about his feelings," Emma said quietly, her decision crystallizing with unexpected clarity. "At least he's never pretended to be something he wasn't to get what he wanted." James's face crumpled with the realization that his revelation had backfired, that Emma's response to Ethan's honesty was acceptance rather than betrayal. "Emma, please, go home, James," Emma said with finality that brooked no argument. "Go home to Victoria, or whoever else you've been seeing while I was stupid enough to wait for you. This is my life now, and my choice, and you have no place in either one." As James walked away with the defeated posture of someone who'd finally lost something irreplaceable, Emma turned to face Ethan with a heart that was racing for entirely new reasons. 3 years?" Emma asked softly. 3 years, Ethan confirmed, his hands reaching toward her with careful reverence. "Emma, I never wanted you to find out like this. I never wanted to put you in a position where you had to question my motives." "I'm not questioning them," Emma replied with surprising certainty, stepping closer until she could feel the heat radiating from his powerful frame. "I'm just wondering why it took James cheating for me to finally see what was right in front of me." Ethan's kiss was soft, reverent, completely different from the desperate passion she'd witnessed between James and Victoria. This was worship disguised as romance. 3 years of suppressed longing finally given permission to bloom into something beautiful and dangerous and absolutely terrifying in its intensity. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard and staring at each other with the kind of wonder that accompanies the recognition of something that was always meant to be. "Welcome home, Mrs. Walsh." Ethan murmured against her lips, and for the first time since her world had fallen apart, Emma felt like she was exactly where she belonged. Chapter 5. The Hidden Truth. The Millbrook Public Library had been Emma's sanctuary for over 2 years. Its quiet dignity and endless possibilities offering refuge from a world that often felt too loud and demanding for someone who preferred books to people and substance to superficial social climbing. This morning, however, the familiar comfort of her workplace was overshadowed by the stack of thank you letters that had mysteriously appeared on her desk overnight. Each one a piece of a puzzle that would completely redefine her understanding of the past 3 years. Anonymous donation enables literacy program expansion, read the first letter from Mrs. Garcia, whose 8-year-old daughter had learned to read through Emma's after-school tutoring initiative. We cannot thank the generous benefactor enough for making this program possible for families who couldn't otherwise afford private tutoring. Emma's hands trembled as she reached for the second letter, then the third, each one expressing gratitude for programs and improvements she'd assumed were funded through James's connections and her own grant-writing efforts. New computers for the children's section, expanded hours that required additional staffing, weekend literacy workshops that had transformed reading levels throughout the county, all of it apparently made possible by an anonymous donor whose generosity had enabled Emma's vision to flourish beyond her wildest dreams. Furthermore, the timing of these letters felt deliberately orchestrated, as if someone had wanted her to discover the truth about their funding source at exactly this moment in her life. "Emma?" came a gentle voice from the library's main entrance. "I hope you don't mind the intrusion, but I wanted to check on you after everything that's happened." Emma looked up to find Margaret Stevens, the library board's chairwoman, approaching her desk with the kind of maternal concern that had sustained Emma through many professional challenges. Margaret's silver hair was perfectly styled despite the early hour, her dignified bearing reminding Emma that some people managed to navigate Millbrook's social complexities with grace rather than calculation. "Mrs. Stevens?" Emma said, quickly gathering the letters before their contents could be observed by curious eyes. "I wasn't expecting anyone this early." "I imagine you weren't expecting a lot of things that have happened recently," Margaret replied with gentle understanding, settling into the chair across from Emma's desk with careful deliberation. "Emma, dear, there's something I need to tell you about your programs here at the library. Something I probably should have shared long ago." Emma's pulse quickened as she recognized the significance in Margaret's tone. The weight of revelation that suggested her morning's discoveries were only the beginning of a much larger truth. "The anonymous donations," Emma said quietly, her voice barely audible in the library's hushed atmosphere. "Someone's been funding everything, haven't they? The expansion, the new programs, all the improvements I thought were happening because of my grant applications." Margaret's smile was soft but knowing, carrying the satisfaction of someone who'd been keeping a wonderful secret for far too long. "Your grant applications were excellent, dear, but they weren't what made your dreams possible. You've had a guardian angel for the past 3 years, someone who believed in your vision enough to make it reality." "Who?" Emma whispered, though her heart was already racing with possibilities she'd never dared consider. "Ethan Walsh," Margaret said simply. "Every dollar that made your literacy programs possible, every piece of equipment that transformed this library into the community center it's become, every opportunity you've had to help children who might otherwise fall through educational cracks, all of it came from Ethan's personal foundation." Emma felt the world tilt sideways as understanding crashed over her in waves that threatened to sweep away every assumption she'd made about her professional accomplishments and personal relationships. But James said his connections at the hospital helped secure funding. He said his family's influence opened doors. James took credit for Ethan's generosity, Margaret interrupted with gentle firmness, her expression carrying the weight of truth too long suppressed. Ethan specifically requested that his contributions remain anonymous, but he asked James to present the opportunities to you so you wouldn't feel awkward about accepting help from someone outside your social circle. The revelation hit Emma like physical violence, forcing her to confront the devastating reality that her greatest professional achievements had been made possible by the man she'd dismissed as James's rough-around-the-edges best friend, while the man she'd loved and trusted had been claiming credit for kindness he'd never shown. "How long have you known?" Emma asked, her voice barely a whisper as she processed the implications of Margaret's disclosure. "Since the beginning," Margaret admitted with obvious regret. "Ethan made me promise to keep his involvement private, but after what happened at your engagement party, I felt you deserved to know the truth about who's really been supporting your dreams." Emma rose from her desk chair on unsteady legs, moving toward the children's section where bright new computers hummed quietly, and shelves full of books invited young minds to explore worlds beyond Millbrook's boundaries. Every detail she'd attributed to successful grant writing or James's networking had actually been Ethan's gift, his investment in her vision for community education. Moreover, the scope of his contributions suggested planning and attention that went far beyond casual charity. This was someone who'd studied her goals, understood her methods, and provided exactly what she needed to succeed without ever asking for recognition or gratitude. "The weekend literacy workshops," Emma said slowly, her mind cataloging the full extent of Ethan's hidden support. "The transportation vouchers for families who couldn't afford gas money, the take-home book programs, the summer reading incentives, all of it?" "All of it," Margaret confirmed with gentle sympathy. "Emma, that man has been moving heaven and earth to help you achieve your goals while James has been taking bows for accomplishments he had nothing to do with." Emma felt tears threatening as she realized how completely she'd misunderstood the dynamics of her own life, how thoroughly James had manipulated her perception of their relationship and his role in her success. The man she'd thought was supporting her career had been stealing credit from someone else's generosity, while the man she'd barely noticed had been quietly funding her dreams. "Why?" Emma whispered, her voice breaking on the single word that encompassed her confusion, gratitude, and growing recognition of feelings she'd been suppressing for years. "Because he loves you," Margaret said simply. "Because he's been in love with you since the day James brought you to that first library board meeting. And because seeing you happy has been more important to him than receiving recognition for making that happiness possible." Emma sank into one of the small chairs in the children's reading area, her mind reeling with the implications of Margaret's revelations. Every conversation with James about her work, every celebration of successful programs, every moment of pride in her professional accomplishments had been tainted by deception she'd been too trusting to recognize. Furthermore, every interaction with Ethan took on new significance when viewed through the lens of his hidden support. The way he'd asked detailed questions about her programs, his obvious pride when she'd discussed successful initiatives, his careful attention to details that should have mattered only to someone personally invested in her success. "He never said anything," Emma said more to herself than to Margaret. 3 years of watching James take credit for his generosity, and he never said a word. "That's the kind of man Ethan is," Margaret replied with obvious admiration. "He gives without expecting recognition, loves without demanding reciprocation, and protects without advertising his protection. You've married a good man, Emma. Perhaps the best man any of us have ever known." As Margaret gathered her things to leave, Emma remained in the children's section, surrounded by evidence of love disguised as anonymous charity and support masquerading as coincidental opportunity. The thank you letters on her desk told stories of lives changed by programs she'd believed were possible through her own merit, when they'd actually been gifts from someone who'd seen her potential and chosen to nurture it from the shadows. The most devastating part wasn't even James's deception. It was recognizing how blind she'd been to Ethan's feelings, how thoroughly she'd dismissed someone who'd been demonstrating his devotion through actions rather than words for years. Moreover, she was beginning to understand that her attraction to Ethan hadn't begun with his marriage proposal, but had been growing slowly, steadily, unconsciously throughout her relationship with James, suppressed beneath layers of loyalty and social expectation that had kept her from seeing what was right in front of her. As Emma locked the library and headed home to confront her new husband about the extent of his hidden generosity, She carried with her the weight of revelation that would transform their marriage from convenient fiction into something far more complicated and infinitely more precious. The man she'd married to save face had been loving her in secret for years, and she was about to discover whether the feelings growing in her own heart were strong enough to bridge the gap between gratitude and genuine love. Chapter 6. The Confession. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Ethan's workshop, transforming the practical space into something almost cathedral-like, with its soaring ceiling and golden light filtering through clear-story windows. Emma found Ethan exactly where she'd expected, bent over his drafting table, working on architectural plans with the focused intensity that had built his construction business into Millbrook's most respected enterprise. The workshop itself told stories about its owner that Emma was only beginning to understand. Hand tools arranged with military precision, half-finished furniture projects that spoke to artistic sensibilities she'd never recognized, and walls covered with photographs of completed buildings that represented years of creating something meaningful from raw materials and stubborn vision. Furthermore, she could see elements of their home reflected in the careful craftsmanship surrounding her, evidence that Ethan approached everything in his life with the same attention to detail that had made her library programs possible. "Emma," Ethan said without looking up from his plans, though his voice carried warmth that suggested her presence was welcome, despite the obvious tension in her posture. "How was your day at the library?" "Illuminating," Emma replied carefully, moving closer to study the blueprint spread across his work surface. "What are you working on?" "Community center proposal for the Henderson property," Ethan said, finally raising his eyes to meet hers with the kind of direct honesty she was learning to associate with everything he did. "The town council's been talking about need for recreational facilities, especially for teenagers who don't have safe places to gather after school." Emma studied the plans with growing amazement, recognizing the scope and vision behind what Ethan was designing. Not just a building, but a comprehensive solution to problems she'd been addressing through her library programs. Multi-purpose rooms for tutoring and literacy workshops, computer labs for students without home access to technology, even a dedicated space for the kind of community meetings that could strengthen Millbrook's social fabric. Moreover, the way he spoke about the project suggested personal investment that went beyond professional obligation, the same quiet passion she'd heard in his voice when he discussed their home. "This would cost hundreds of thousands of dollars to build," Emma observed, her mind calculating the financial implications of Ethan's ambitious design. "The Walsh Foundation has been looking for worthy projects," Ethan replied with studied casualness that made Emma's pulse quicken with recognition. "This seems like something that could benefit the entire community." Emma felt her breath catch as another piece of the puzzle clicked into place. "The Walsh Foundation, the same foundation that's been funding my library programs for the past 3 years." Ethan's hands stilled on the blueprint, his entire body going tense as he recognized the trap he'd walked into with his unconscious honesty. "Emma?" "Margaret told me," Emma said quietly, moving around the drafting table until she was close enough to see the conflict playing across Ethan's features. "About the donations, the equipment purchases, all the funding that made my dreams possible while James took credit for your generosity." The workshop fell silent except for the ambient sounds of late afternoon, birds calling in the trees outside, the distant hum of traffic on Main Street, the soft whisper of Emma's breathing as she waited for Ethan to explain 3 years of deception disguised as kindness. "I didn't want you to know," Ethan said finally, his voice rough with emotion he'd been suppressing for years. "I didn't want you to feel obligated or uncomfortable or like you owed me anything for supporting work you were already doing brilliantly." "But you let James take credit," Emma said, her voice carrying hurt that went beyond professional betrayal to something deeper, more personal. "You let him convince me that his connections and influence were making my programs possible when it was your money, your foundation, your belief in what I was trying to accomplish." Ethan's laugh held no humor, only bitter recognition of choices that had seemed wise at the time but felt increasingly painful in retrospect. "James is good at taking credit for other people's accomplishments. Always has been, even when we were kids. Then why? Emma demanded, moving closer until she could see the pain in Ethan's eyes, the weight of unspoken longing that had shaped years of hidden support. Why fund my programs? Why let him take credit? Why help me succeed while watching him reap the benefits of your generosity? Ethan was quiet for so long that Emma wondered if he would answer at all. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of truth too long suppressed. Because watching you succeed made me happy, Ethan said simply. Because seeing your face light up when you talked about children learning to read was worth any amount of money or recognition. Because loving you meant wanting you to achieve your dreams, even if I could never be part of them. The confession hit Emma like a physical blow, forcing her to confront the reality that she'd been loved with depth and constancy she'd never recognized while settling for James's casual affection and intermittent attention. 3 years, Emma whispered, her voice breaking on the implications of Ethan's patient devotion. You've been loving me and supporting me for 3 years while I was completely oblivious. Not oblivious, Ethan corrected gently, his hands coming up to frame her face with the reverent care she was learning to crave. Just loyal to someone who didn't deserve your loyalty. I couldn't compete with James's charm or medical degree or social status, but I could make sure you had everything you needed to succeed. Emma felt tears streaming down her cheeks as she processed the magnitude of Ethan's sacrifice. Years of watching her love another man while quietly ensuring her happiness from the shadows, funding her professional dreams while suppressing his personal ones. Moreover, she was beginning to understand that her growing attraction to Ethan wasn't new, but had been developing slowly, unconsciously, every time he'd shown interest in her work or pride in her accomplishments, while James had been distracted by other concerns. I should have seen it, Emma said desperately, her hands covering his where they rested against her cheeks. I should have noticed how much you cared, how invested you were in things that mattered to me. You saw what you wanted to see, Ethan replied with gentle understanding that carried no judgment, only acceptance of circumstances that had kept them apart for years. You loved James, and I respected that love even when I wished circumstances were different. And now? Emma asked, her heart racing as she recognized the implications of their marriage and the feelings growing stronger every day, despite the complicated foundation of their relationship. Now I get to love you openly, Ethan said with quiet conviction, his thumbs tracing patterns across her cheekbones that made her pulse quicken with dangerous awareness. Now I get to support your dreams without hiding my investment in your success. Now I get to be the man you turn to instead of the one watching from the sidelines. Emma's answer came in the form of a kiss that tasted like gratitude and possibility, and the beginning of something that had been waiting to bloom for years. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard and staring at each other with the kind of wonder that accompanies the recognition of feelings that were always meant to be. I love you, Emma whispered against Ethan's lips, the words carrying weight of revelation rather than obligation. Not because you funded my programs or because you saved me from humiliation, but because you're the most genuinely good man I've ever known. Even though I deceived you about the funding, especially because you deceived me about the funding, Emma replied with growing certainty. You gave without expecting recognition, loved without demanding reciprocation, and supported my dreams while asking for nothing in return. That's not deception, Ethan. That's devotion. As they held each other in the golden light of his workshop, surrounded by evidence of his ability to create beauty and meaning from raw materials, Emma realized that their marriage had evolved from convenient fiction into the most authentic relationship she'd ever experienced. The man she'd married to save face had been saving her in ways she was only beginning to understand, and the love growing between them felt like coming home to a place she'd been searching for without knowing it existed. Chapter 7. The Community Pressure. The monthly Millbrook Town Council meeting had never seen attendance like tonight's standing room-only crowd. Every folding chair occupied and additional residents lining the walls with the kind of electric anticipation that preceded either triumph or disaster. Emma sat in the front row with her presentation materials organized with military precision, her heart hammering against her ribs as she prepared to advocate for the library expansion project that would determine not just her professional future, but her growing sense of belonging in the community she'd chosen to call home. Beside her, Ethan's presence radiated calm confidence that helped steady her nerves, despite the obviously hostile energy emanating from certain corners of the room. James and Victoria occupied seats directly behind the council table, their positioning clearly strategic and their expressions carrying the kind of smug satisfaction that suggested they'd been working to undermine tonight's proceedings. "The chair recognizes Emma Walsh," announced Mayor Henderson with the careful neutrality of someone trying to avoid taking sides in what had obviously become Millbrook's most contentious social issue since the Christmas tree controversy of 2019. Emma rose on unsteady legs, her prepared speech suddenly feeling inadequate given the weight of scrutiny from neighbors who'd known her since childhood and were now questioning everything they'd believed about her character and judgment. "Thank you, Mayor Henderson," Emma began, her voice gaining strength as she focused on the facts and figures that had always been her professional refuge. "The library expansion proposal represents a 50% increase in our ability to serve community literacy needs, with particular emphasis on early childhood education and adult learning programs that have already demonstrated measurable impact." As Emma presented her carefully researched statistics and testimonials from grateful families, she felt her confidence building with each success story, an educational milestone that validated years of dedication to improving Millbrook's intellectual resources. Furthermore, she could see approval in the faces of council members who understood the value of investing in community education, parents who'd witnessed their children's progress through her programs, and longtime residents who remembered when the library had been nothing more than a glorified storage room for outdated reference books. "The proposed expansion would cost the township exactly nothing," Emma continued with growing conviction, "as the Walsh Foundation has committed to funding the entire project in exchange for naming rights that honor local educators who've served our community with distinction." "How convenient," came Victoria's voice from the gallery, sharp with the kind of calculated malice that could derail productive discussion. The new Mrs. Walsh advocating for a project funded by her husband's foundation. Some might call that a conflict of interest. Emma felt her cheeks flush with heat as murmurs of agreement rippled through portions of the crowd, the implication of Victoria's comment clear to everyone present. Her marriage to Ethan was being painted as opportunistic networking rather than genuine partnership, her professional advocacy reduced to wifely obligation. "The Walsh Foundation has been supporting library programs for 3 years," Emma replied with steady determination, her voice carrying clearly through the meeting room despite her racing pulse. "Long before my personal relationship with Ethan Walsh, his foundation recognized the value of community literacy initiatives and provided funding that enabled measurable improvements in local education outcomes." "Under your previous fiancé's guidance," James interjected with cruel precision, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to commanding attention in medical settings. "When Dr. Richardson was involved in facilitating foundation partnerships, the programs maintained professional objectivity. Now we're being asked to approve projects that directly benefit the foundation director's wife." Emma felt the room's energy shift as James's implication took hold, that her marriage to Ethan represented corruption of professional ethics, that her advocacy for community programs was tainted by personal gain rather than public service. Moreover, she could see doubt creeping into faces that had been supportive moments earlier, community trust eroding under the weight of suggested impropriety. "That's enough." Ethan's voice cut through the developing murmur with quiet authority that commanded immediate attention from everyone present. He rose from his seat with fluid grace, his presence transforming the dynamic of the room as surely as if a predator had entered a gathering of prey. "Emma Walsh has done more for education in this community than anyone else in the past decade," Ethan continued with controlled fury that made smart people uncomfortable. "Her programs have improved reading levels, increased high school graduation rates, and provided opportunities for families who couldn't otherwise afford educational support. Anyone suggesting that her advocacy is motivated by personal gain rather than community service obviously doesn't understand the woman they're attempting to discredit. Emma felt warmth flooding her chest as she watched Ethan defend her competence and integrity with passionate conviction that left no doubt about his respect for her professional accomplishments. Furthermore, his willingness to confront the entire room on her behalf demonstrated the kind of partnership she'd never experienced with James, who'd always been more concerned with protecting his own reputation than defending hers. "Mr. Walsh," Mayor Henderson said with careful diplomatic authority, "while your support for your wife is admirable, the council needs to consider all perspectives on municipal spending priorities." "Then consider this perspective," Ethan replied with steel creeping into his voice. "Emma's literacy programs have a documented return on investment that exceeds every other community initiative in Millbrook's budget. Children who participate in her tutoring programs score higher on standardized tests, graduate high school at increased rates, and pursue post-secondary education at twice the county average." Emma watched in amazement as Ethan systematically dismantled every objection to her proposal with facts and figures she hadn't realized he'd been tracking, his defense of her work revealing knowledge that went far beyond casual spousal support to genuine understanding of her professional methods and achievements. "The foundation's support for these programs isn't nepotism," Ethan continued with growing intensity. "It's investment in proven success that benefits every family in this community. Anyone opposing this expansion is choosing politics over children's education, and that's a choice they'll have to explain to voters who care more about their kids' future than about gossip and social drama." The room fell silent as Ethan's words settled into the collective consciousness, his challenge forcing everyone present to confront the reality that opposition to Emma's proposal was motivated by personal animus rather than legitimate policy concerns. "I move to approve the library expansion as proposed," said Councilwoman Martinez with decisive authority that broke the tension like a snapped wire. "All in favor?" Emma held her breath as hands rose around the council table. First 3, then 4, then the decisive 5th vote that approved her project despite the opposition that had threatened to derail months of planning and preparation. "Motion carries," Mayor Henderson announced with obvious relief. "The library expansion is approved for immediate implementation." As the meeting dissolved into conversations and congratulations, Emma found herself surrounded by supporters who'd been silent during the confrontation, but were now eager to express approval for her work and Ethan's defense of community priorities. "You two make quite a team," observed Margaret Stevens with satisfaction that suggested she'd been expecting tonight's outcome despite the obvious challenges. Emma's vision and Ethan's ability to make things happen, Millbrook is lucky to have both of you working together. Emma looked up at Ethan, who was accepting congratulations with the kind of modest grace that deflected attention back to her accomplishments rather than claiming credit for tonight's success. "Thank you," Emma said quietly, her voice carrying gratitude that went far beyond professional support to recognition of partnership she'd never experienced before. "Thank you for giving me something worth fighting for," Ethan replied with gentle intensity that made her pulse quicken with awareness that their marriage was becoming something far more significant than either of them had originally intended. As they left the town hall hand in hand, Emma realized that tonight had marked a turning point, not just in her professional standing, but in her understanding of what it meant to be genuinely supported by someone who saw her potential and was willing to defend it against any opposition. The fake marriage that had begun as damage control was evolving into the most authentic partnership she'd ever known, and the man she'd married out of desperation was proving to be exactly the person she'd been waiting for, without knowing it. Chapter 8. The Real Wedding. The Millbrook Public Library had been transformed into something magical for Saturday afternoon's ceremony, its usual institutional atmosphere softened by hundreds of white roses, and the kind of warm lighting that made even the most practical spaces feel touched by romance. Emma stood before the bathroom mirror in the library's back office, adjusting her simple white dress with hands that trembled slightly, despite her growing certainty that she was about to make the most important decision of her life. 3 weeks had passed since the town council meeting, that had established her and Ethan as a formidable team in Millbrook's civic landscape. 3 weeks of working together on the library expansion, while navigating the increasingly complicated emotions that had transformed their marriage of convenience into something far more profound and dangerous. Moreover, tonight's ceremony represented their choice to replace legal expedience with emotional authenticity, to exchange vows that reflected their growing love rather than their mutual need for social protection. "You look beautiful," came Margaret's voice from the doorway, accompanied by the kind of maternal warmth that had sustained Emma through many professional challenges. "Are you ready for this?" "I've never been more ready for anything," Emma replied with surprising conviction, her reflection showing a woman transformed by weeks of being genuinely cherished rather than merely tolerated. The library's main room had been arranged with folding chairs borrowed from the church, their practical simplicity somehow perfect for a couple whose love had grown from shared work and mutual respect, rather than dramatic passion and social expectations. Emma's chosen family filled the space: library patrons whose children had benefited from her programs, fellow educators who'd supported her vision, and longtime Millbrook residents who'd watched her grow from shy teenager to confident community leader. Furthermore, the absence of certain expected guests spoke volumes about the social lines that had been drawn since her engagement to Ethan became public knowledge. "Emma," Ethan said softly as she emerged from the back office, his voice carrying the same wonder she heard every time he looked at her, as if he couldn't quite believe she'd chosen him over easier alternatives. Ethan stood near the circulation desk wearing a charcoal suit that emphasized his powerful frame and green eyes, his usual commanding presence softened by vulnerability that revealed how much this moment meant to him. Beside him, Judge Morrison waited with patient dignity, his weathered face carrying approval for a union he'd been honored to facilitate. "Dearly beloved," Judge Morrison began as Emma and Ethan joined hands before the assembled witnesses. "We gather today not to witness the beginning of a relationship, but to celebrate the recognition of love that has been growing for years, waiting for the right moment to bloom into something beautiful and lasting." Emma felt tears threatening as she looked into Ethan's eyes, seeing her entire future reflected in their green depths, along with gratitude for a journey that had brought them from the shadows of other people's expectations into the light of their own authentic connection. "Emma and Ethan have written their own vows," Judge Morrison continued with gentle authority. "Words that reflect not just their promises for the future, but their understanding of the love that has brought them to this moment." "Emma," Ethan began, his voice steady despite the emotion visible in his expression. 3 years ago, I fell in love with a woman who saw potential in every child, who believed education could transform communities, and who worked tirelessly to make her dreams reality even when the world didn't recognize her efforts." Emma's heart raced as she listened to Ethan describe not just his feelings, but his deep understanding of what motivated her, what brought her joy, what gave her life meaning beyond social approval or personal comfort. "I loved you from a distance," Ethan continued with growing conviction, "supporting your work because seeing you succeed made me happy, even when I couldn't be part of your happiness. Today, I promise to love you openly, to support your dreams as your partner rather than your secret benefactor, and to spend every day proving that you made the right choice when you chose authenticity over expectation." Emma felt her composure threatening to crumble under the weight of Ethan's devotion, his promise to continue loving her in ways she'd never recognized she needed until he'd shown her the difference between being taken for granted and being treasured. "Ethan," Emma said when it was her turn to speak, her voice carrying strength she'd developed through weeks of being genuinely supported, "I promise to love not just the man you are, but the man you've been all along, the one who gives without expecting recognition, who builds without demanding credit, who protects without advertising his protection." She could see emotion flickering across Ethan's features as she spoke, recognition that her vows were acknowledging years of hidden devotion that had finally been brought into the light. "I promise to be your partner in every sense," Emma continued with growing confidence, to support your dreams the way you've supported mine, to stand beside you against any challenge, and to never again be blind to love that's been right in front of me. By the power vested in me by the state and the trust invested in me by this community, Judge Morrison announced with obvious satisfaction, I pronounce you husband and wife, again, but this time for all the right reasons. Ethan's kiss was soft, reverent, completely different from the desperate passion that had defined her relationship with James. This was worship disguised as romance, the culmination of years of patient longing finally given permission to bloom into something beautiful and lasting. When they broke apart, both were smiling through tears of pure joy, surrounded by applause from witnesses who understood that they'd just observed something rare and precious, the recognition of love that had been waiting years to be acknowledged. So, Emma whispered as they moved through the receiving line of congratulations and well wishes, how does it feel to be married to the librarian who's going to revolutionize Millbrook's educational landscape? Like the luckiest man who ever lived, Ethan replied without hesitation, his arm tightening around her waist with possessive pride that made her pulse quicken with awareness of their transformed relationship. As they cut the cake that Margaret had somehow arranged to appear during the ceremony, Emma reflected on the journey that had brought her from James's betrayal to Ethan's devotion, from public humiliation to community recognition, from settling for crumbs of affection to being loved with depth and constancy she'd never believed possible. Any regrets? Ethan asked softly as they danced to music provided by the library's small sound system, their reception as practical and perfect as everything else about their relationship. Only one, Emma replied with a mischievous smile that made his heart skip. I wish I'd been brave enough to see what was right in front of me sooner, so we could have had more time to build this beautiful life together. We have forever now, Ethan said, echoing promises they'd made during darker moments when their future had seemed uncertain. And I intend to spend every day of that forever proving that some love stories are worth waiting for, no matter how long they take to begin. As they swayed together in the library that had become the foundation of their partnership, surrounded by books that had always been Emma's refuge and witnesses who'd supported their unconventional journey, both knew they'd found something rare and precious, love built on mutual respect, shared values, and the kind of partnership that made both people stronger than they could ever be alone. The woman who'd been discarded by a man who didn't recognize her worth had found someone who'd been treasuring her from the shadows for years, and the man who'd loved in silence had finally found his voice to speak the devotion he'd been demonstrating through actions all along. Their fairy tale hadn't begun with a meet-cute or dramatic passion, but with the steady recognition that the most important love stories are built on friendship, respect, and the choice to see someone's value even when the world overlooks it. Chapter 9. The Past Revealed. Murphy's Diner buzzed with the usual Saturday morning energy of a small-town gathering place, but Emma felt the subtle shift in atmosphere the moment she and Ethan entered hand-in-hand for their weekly breakfast tradition. Conversations died just a beat too long before resuming. Eyes followed their progress to their usual booth, and the general warmth that had begun to surround their marriage was tainted by something that felt suspiciously like fresh gossip. Emma, Ethan, called Dolores Murphy from behind the counter, her greeting carrying the kind of forced cheer that preceded uncomfortable conversations. Your usual table's waiting. As they settled into the red vinyl booth that had become their Saturday sanctuary, Emma noticed James and Victoria occupying a prominent table near the diner's front windows, their positioning clearly strategic and their expressions carrying the kind of satisfaction that suggested they'd been holding court for quite some time. Furthermore, the way other patrons kept glancing between their table and James's suggested that whatever information was being circulated had already contaminated the social atmosphere Emma and Ethan had worked so hard to improve. Ignore them, Ethan said quietly, his hand covering hers on the table with protective warmth that helped steady her nerves. Whatever they're planning, we'll handle it together. Emma nodded, though she could feel anxiety building in her chest as she recognized the pattern of James's manipulative tactics, the careful positioning to maximize audience, the timing designed for maximum social impact. the obvious preparation that suggested coordinated attack rather than casual conversation. Moreover, she was beginning to understand that James's acceptance of their marriage had been temporary strategy, rather than genuine resignation, that he'd been planning some form of retaliation for weeks while appearing to respect her choice. Well, James's voice carried clearly across the diner as he rose from his table with theatrical timing. If it isn't Millbrook's newest power couple, how are you enjoying married life, Emma? We're very happy, thank you, Emma replied with careful politeness, though her pulse quickened as she recognized the predatory gleam in James's eyes. I'm sure you are, James continued with false warmth that made several other patrons turn to observe the developing confrontation. Though I have to wonder if you'd be quite so happy if you knew the whole truth about your husband's past. Emma felt Ethan tense beside her, his entire body going rigid with the kind of controlled fury that suggested James had just crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Careful, James, Ethan said with deadly quiet that made smart people uncomfortable. You're about to say something that destroys whatever's left of our friendship permanently. Our friendship ended when you decided to take advantage of Emma's emotional vulnerability, James replied with growing confidence, clearly emboldened by the audience his confrontation was attracting. But I think the good people of Millbrook deserve to know exactly what kind of man they're celebrating as a community leader. Victoria joined the conversation with predatory grace, her voice carrying just enough concern to disguise malicious intent. It's really quite shocking when you learn the details. Poor Emma had no idea what she was getting herself into. Emma's stomach clenched with dread as she recognized the setup, the careful orchestration designed to maximum damage to Ethan's reputation and their marriage. What are you talking about? Your husband's juvenile record, James said with cruel satisfaction, producing a manila folder that suggested extensive research and deliberate planning. Arrest records, court proceedings, the kind of youthful indiscretions that most people would want to know about before entering into marriage. The diner fell silent except for the ambient sounds of kitchen work and the soft whisper of shocked breathing as James's implications settled into the collective consciousness. Emma felt her world tilting as she processed the reality that Ethan had hidden significant details about his past, that their marriage might be built on foundations more complicated than she'd realized. Assault charges when he was 17, James continued with clinical precision, his voice carrying clearly enough for every patron to hear every damaging detail. Bar fights, property damage, the kind of pattern that suggests anger management problems that don't simply disappear with age. Emma's hands trembled as she looked at Ethan, searching his face for denial or explanation that would make James's accusations less damaging. Instead, she found resignation and something that looked suspiciously like shame. It's true, Ethan said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of truth he'd obviously hoped never to reveal. I was arrested 3 times as a teenager. Assault, vandalism, disturbing the peace. All of it's true. The admission hit Emma like a physical blow, forcing her to confront the reality that the man she'd married had deliberately concealed aspects of his past that cast serious doubt on his character and judgment. Furthermore, the way James had presented the information suggested that these weren't minor teenage mistakes, but part of a pattern that raised questions about Ethan's fundamental nature. But that's not the whole story, Ethan continued with growing determination, his gaze moving around the diner to address everyone present rather than just Emma. What James isn't telling you is why those charges were filed. Does it matter? Victoria interjected with false concern that barely disguised her satisfaction at the damage being inflicted. Violence is violence regardless of the circumstances. It matters, Ethan replied with steel creeping into his voice, because every one of those arrests was for defending someone who couldn't defend themselves. The assault charge was for stopping a man from beating his wife in a parking lot. The vandalism was spray painting over racist graffiti at the high school. The disturbing the peace was breaking up a fight where 3 older boys were attacking a kid with disabilities. Emma felt her understanding of the situation shifting as Ethan provided context that transformed his arrests from evidence of criminal tendencies into proof of protective instincts that had simply been expressed through teenage methods. Moreover, she was beginning to recognize that James's attack was designed to exploit exactly the kind of incomplete information that made good deeds look like criminal behavior when stripped of context. "Easy claims to make 20 years later," James said with dismissive authority, though his confidence was beginning to waver under the weight of Ethan's explanations. "Convenient justifications for a pattern of violence." "Not convenient," came a voice from the diner's entrance. "Documented." Emma turned to see Police Chief Robert Martinez entering with the kind of authoritative presence that commanded immediate attention from everyone present. In his hands, he carried what appeared to be official documentation that suggested he'd been monitoring the confrontation and had arrived with specific purpose. "Chief Martinez," James said with obvious discomfort, his calculated attack suddenly complicated by the presence of law enforcement authority. "Dr. Richardson," Chief Martinez replied with professional courtesy that carried undertones of disapproval. "I couldn't help but overhear your discussion of Mr. Walsh's juvenile record. Since you seem interested in sharing details about past legal proceedings, I thought you might want the complete file rather than whatever selective information you've obtained." Emma felt her pulse quicken as she recognized the implications of Chief Martinez's intervention, that James's accusations were not only incomplete but deliberately misleading. "Every incident Mr. Walsh mentioned is documented exactly as he described," Chief Martinez continued with calm authority, his voice carrying clearly through the now silent diner. "3 arrests, all for intervening in situations where citizens were being victimized by people who should have known better." The police chief moved to stand beside Emma and Ethan's table, his presence clearly indicating whose side he was taking in this public confrontation. "The assault charge involved stopping a domestic violence incident where the victim was too afraid to press charges against her abuser," Chief Martinez said with growing conviction. "The vandalism charge was for covering hate speech with positive messages about community unity. The disturbing the peace charge was for breaking up an assault on a disabled student that 3 adult witnesses watched without intervening." Emma watched James's face flush with embarrassment as the police chief systematically dismantled the attack that had seemed so damaging moments earlier. "Furthermore," Chief Martinez continued with relentless precision, "Mr. Walsh was 17 years old during these incidents, protecting people when adults who should have been responsible chose to look the other way. The juvenile court judge specifically noted his character and motivation when dismissing all charges after community service completion." "That's not," James began desperately, but Chief Martinez cut him off with professional authority. "Dr. Richardson, you're presenting partial information to damage the reputation of a man whose worst crime was having the courage to act when others remained passive. If you want to discuss character, perhaps we should talk about physicians who use their medical knowledge to manipulate prescription medications for personal advantage." The implication hit James like a physical blow, his face going pale as he realized that his attack on Ethan had exposed him to scrutiny he definitely didn't want. "I don't know what you're suggesting," James said with diminishing confidence. "I'm suggesting that people who live in glass houses shouldn't throw stones," Chief Martinez replied with quiet menace, "especially when those stones might shatter windows they'd prefer to keep intact." Emma felt something fierce and protective surge through her chest as she watched the community rally around Ethan, defending not just his past actions, but his current character against attacks designed to destroy their marriage. "Chief Martinez is right," Emma said, rising from her seat with newfound determination. "Ethan has spent his entire adult life protecting and supporting this community. Anyone suggesting that teenage acts of courage disqualify him from respect obviously doesn't understand what real character looks like." Around the diner, heads nodded in agreement as other patrons began expressing support for Ethan and disapproval for James's manipulative tactics. "The boy who stopped domestic violence became the man who funds literacy programs," added Margaret Stevens, who had apparently been quietly observing from a corner booth. "The teenager who covered hate speech with positive messages became the adult who builds community centers. Character doesn't change, Dr. Richardson. It just becomes more refined with age." James looked around the diner with growing desperation as he realized that his attempt to destroy Ethan's reputation had backfired spectacularly, turning the community against him instead of his intended target. "This isn't over," James said with quiet fury, his threat directed at both Emma and Ethan as he prepared to leave. "Yes, it is," Emma replied with steel in her voice that surprised everyone present, including herself. "It's been over since the night you chose Victoria over our relationship. Everything since then has just been you refusing to accept consequences for your own choices." As James and Victoria left the diner with wounded pride and public humiliation, Emma felt Ethan's arm slide around her waist with protective possessiveness that made her pulse race with awareness of how much their relationship had deepened through adversity. "Thank you," Ethan said quietly, his voice rough with emotion that spoke to years of carrying shame for actions that had actually demonstrated heroic character. "Thank you for being exactly the man I thought you were," Emma replied with growing conviction. "Thank you for having the courage to protect people who needed protection, even when it cost you something personally." Around them, the diner's normal Saturday morning energy resumed, but with an added warmth that suggested the community had chosen sides definitively and was comfortable with their choice. "You know," Chief Martinez said as he prepared to leave, "Millbrook's lucky to have both of you. The community needs people who are willing to fight for what's right, even when it's difficult." As Emma and Ethan sat together in their booth, hands intertwined and hearts full of gratitude for a community that had rallied to their defense, both realized that their marriage had passed its most serious test and emerged stronger than ever. The crisis that had threatened to destroy their happiness had instead proven that their love was built on foundations solid enough to withstand any attack, and that sometimes the best defense against lies was simply living a life that made the truth obvious to anyone willing to see it. Chapter 10. The Breaking Point. The Millbrook Public Library had never felt more like home than it did on Monday evening as Emma worked late organizing materials for the expansion project that would begin construction the following week. The building hummed with quiet purpose around her, its familiar shelves and reading areas soon to be transformed into something even more magnificent through the combined vision of her educational philosophy and Ethan's architectural expertise. Nevertheless, the peaceful atmosphere was shattered by the sound of the front door opening with more force than the building's gentle hinges were designed to handle, followed by footsteps that carried the angry determination of someone who'd been planning this confrontation for days. "Emma." James's voice echoed through the library's main room with the kind of authority he'd once used in medical settings, though now it carried desperation rather than professional confidence. "We need to talk." Emma looked up from her desk to find James approaching with the focused intensity of someone who'd been drinking just enough to loosen inhibitions while maintaining enough control to function. His usually perfect appearance showed signs of strain. Wrinkled shirt, unkempt hair, eyes shadowed with the kind of exhaustion that came from sleepless nights spent plotting revenge. Furthermore, his presence in the library after hours suggested premeditation rather than impulse, careful planning designed to corner her away from Ethan's protective presence. "The library is closed, James," Emma said with careful neutrality, her hand moving subtly toward her phone as she recognized the potential danger in being alone with a man whose entire world had been systematically dismantled over the past month. "Whatever you want to discuss can wait until—" "Nothing can wait," James interrupted with growing agitation, his movement closer to her desk carrying the predatory energy of someone who'd decided that reasonable approaches had failed. "Do you have any idea what you've done to my life? What your little revenge marriage has cost me?" Emma felt ice-cold fear settle in her chest as she processed the implications of James's words. The way his approaching breakdown was transforming him from merely vindictive into something potentially dangerous. "I haven't done anything to your life," Emma replied with as much strength as she could muster. "I made choices about my own life after you destroyed our relationship with your infidelity." "Your choices destroyed everything!" James's voice rose to just below a shout, his composure cracking under the weight of consequences he'd apparently never considered. Victoria's father pulled his support for the medical center expansion. The hospital board is questioning my judgment. People who used to respect me now look at me like I'm the villain in your fairy tale romance. Emma stood slowly, placing her desk between herself and James while trying to project calm authority despite her racing pulse. James, you're upset. Why don't you go home, get some sleep, and we can discuss this when... When what? James laughed with bitter hysteria that made Emma's skin crawl with recognition of how unstable he'd become. When you've finished destroying everything I've worked for? When you've convinced the entire town that I'm the monster and Ethan's the hero? The library's emergency lighting cast strange shadows across James's features, transforming his handsome face into something harder, more dangerous than Emma had ever seen. This wasn't the charming doctor who'd swept her off her feet with promises of fairy tale romance. This was someone whose carefully constructed self-image had been shattered beyond repair. You were supposed to be grateful, James continued with growing desperation, moving around the desk despite Emma's obvious discomfort. You were supposed to understand that what happened with Victoria was meaningless, that you were the one I was going to marry, that you mattered more than some meaningless physical attraction. Emma backed toward the library's rear exit, her mind calculating escape routes while trying to keep James talking, rather than acting on whatever plan had brought him here. I was grateful, James, Emma said carefully, her voice steady despite the terror clawing at her chest. I was grateful for 3 years. I waited, I supported your career, I built my life around your schedule and priorities. What I wasn't willing to do was pretend that catching you with Victoria was meaningless. So you decided to humiliate me publicly by marrying my best friend, James said with vicious satisfaction, his pursuit relentless despite Emma's obvious fear. You decided to make me look like a fool in front of the entire community. I decided to marry someone who values me enough not to cheat, Emma corrected with growing strength, her anger beginning to override her fear. I decided to choose happiness over humiliation, respect over tolerance, love over settling for someone who saw me as convenient rather than treasured. James's face twisted with fury as Emma's words hit their mark, forcing him to confront truths he'd been avoiding since the night his betrayal had been exposed. Ethan doesn't love you, James said with cruel precision, designed to inflict maximum damage. He's obsessed with you, Emma. He's been stalking you for years, funding your programs to manipulate your gratitude, positioning himself to swoop in the moment our relationship showed any weakness. That's not true, Emma said with conviction born from weeks of experiencing Ethan's genuine devotion, though she continued backing toward the exit as James's instability became increasingly obvious. Isn't it? James pressed with growing desperation. Ask yourself why he never pursued you openly. Ask yourself why he waited until you were vulnerable and humiliated before making his move. Ask yourself what kind of man builds his relationship on another man's ruins. Before Emma could respond to James's psychological assault, the library's front door opened with careful precision, followed by Ethan's voice cutting through the charged atmosphere with deadly calm. The kind of man who recognizes that some things are worth waiting for, Ethan said as he appeared in the main room, his presence immediately transforming the dynamic from predator and prey to something far more dangerous for James. The kind of man who would rather love from a distance than interfere with someone else's happiness. James spun toward Ethan with wild desperation, his careful plan for private confrontation ruined by the arrival of the one person who could protect Emma from his increasingly unhinged behavior. How touching, James said with false bravado that couldn't disguise his fear of Ethan's obvious fury. The knight in shining armor arrives to rescue his damsel in distress. The husband arrives to protect his wife from a man who obviously can't accept that she's moved on to someone better, Ethan corrected with quiet menace that made James step back despite his attempts at bravado. Emma felt overwhelming relief flood her system as Ethan moved to stand between her and James, his protective presence immediately making her feel safe, despite the obvious tension in the room. This isn't over, James said with desperate fury, his threat encompassing both Emma and Ethan as he realized that his last attempt at manipulation had failed spectacularly. Yes, it is, Emma said with finality, that carried the weight of absolute conviction. "Yes, it is," Emma said with finality that carried the weight of absolute conviction. "It's been over since the moment you chose someone else over our relationship. Everything since then has just been you refusing to accept responsibility for your own choices." As James left the library with his wounded pride and shattered self-image, Emma felt Ethan's arms close around her with protective tenderness that reminded her exactly why she'd fallen in love with him. "Are you okay?" Ethan asked softly, his hands moving over her with careful reverence as he assured himself that James hadn't hurt her. "I'm perfect," Emma replied with growing certainty. "For the first time in my life, I'm exactly where I belong with exactly the person I was meant to love." The crisis that had threatened to destroy their happiness had instead proven that their love was strong enough to withstand any attack, and that sometimes the greatest victory was simply refusing to let other people's damage define your own happiness. Chapter 11. The New Beginning. 1 year later, the transformed Millbrook Public Library stood as a testament to the power of vision combined with determination, its expanded wings and innovative programming having earned recognition from the state education department and attracted visitors from neighboring counties eager to replicate Emma's successful community education model. The grand reopening celebration filled every corner of the building with laughter, conversation, and the kind of vibrant energy that proved libraries could be social centers as well as repositories of knowledge. Emma moved through the crowd with the confident grace of someone who'd found her true calling, her simple dress and professional bearing reflecting a woman comfortable with her accomplishments and secure in her community standing. The past year had brought challenges and triumphs in equal measure, but each obstacle had only strengthened her resolve and deepened her partnership with the man who'd become her greatest supporter and closest confidant. "Mrs. Walsh," called out Sarah Chen, a young mother whose twins had learned to read through Emma's innovative early literacy program. "I wanted to thank you again for everything you've done for our family. Maya and Marcus are reading at grade level now, and their teachers say they're among the most prepared students in their class." Emma felt the familiar warmth that came from witnessing the real-world impact of her educational philosophy, the satisfaction of knowing that her work was creating lasting change in young lives rather than simply filling time until something more important came along. "It's been my pleasure to work with your children," Emma replied with genuine enthusiasm. "Maya and Marcus are bright, motivated students who just needed the right approach to unlock their potential." Moreover, she could see Ethan across the room, engaged in animated conversation with Mayor Henderson about the community center project that would break ground next month, his obvious pride in her accomplishments evident in every gesture and expression. "Emma," came Margaret Stevens's voice from behind her, accompanied by the kind of excited energy that suggested important news. "There's someone here who'd like to meet you, someone from the state education department who's been very impressed with what you've accomplished." Emma turned to find herself facing Dr. Patricia Williams, whose reputation for innovative educational policy had made her something of a legend among librarians and literacy advocates throughout the region. "Mrs. Walsh," Dr. Williams said with obvious admiration, extending her hand with the respect typically reserved for professional peers rather than small-town librarians. "I've been following your work for the past year, and I'm hoping you might consider discussing some opportunities that could expand your impact beyond Millbrook." Emma felt her pulse quicken as she processed the implications of Dr. Williams's interest, recognizing that her local success had apparently attracted attention from people with the power to amplify her influence on a much larger scale. "What kind of opportunities?" Emma asked, though part of her already suspected the answer would involve choices that would test her commitment to the life she'd built with Ethan. "The state is launching a comprehensive rural literacy initiative," Dr. Williams explained with growing excitement. "We need someone to design and oversee programming for dozens of communities that lack the resources to develop their own innovative approaches. Your methods could benefit thousands of children across the state." Emma felt her breath catch as she considered the magnitude of what Dr. Williams was offering, the chance to impact educational policy on a scale she'd never imagined possible. the opportunity to transform her local success into systemic change that could reshape how rural communities approached literacy education. Furthermore, the timing of the offer felt almost symbolic, arriving exactly 1 year after she'd chosen personal happiness over professional ambition, and discovered that the two weren't mutually exclusive when you had the right partner. It would involve significant travel, Dr. Williams continued, extensive collaboration with state officials, and probably relocation to the capital for at least part of each year. But the impact would be extraordinary. Tens of thousands of children receiving educational opportunities they wouldn't have otherwise. Emma's mind raced through the implications of accepting such a position: the professional recognition, the expanded influence, the chance to work at policy levels she'd only dreamed of reaching. It represented everything she'd once thought she wanted from her career, the kind of success that would validate years of dedication to educational innovation. Nevertheless, as she looked across the room at Ethan, she felt something more powerful than professional ambition: the certainty that the most important work of her life was happening right here, in partnership with the man who'd believed in her vision before she'd believed in it herself. "Dr. Williams," Emma said with growing conviction, "I'm incredibly honored by your offer, and I'd love to discuss ways I could consult on the state initiative while maintaining my base here in Millbrook. This community has invested in my programs, and I believe I can have the greatest impact by continuing to build on what we've started here." Dr. Williams's smile suggested she'd expected this response and respected the reasoning behind it. "Actually, that might be even better. We need someone who understands rural community dynamics, someone who's proven that innovative programming can work in small-town settings. Would you be interested in developing a consultation model that allows you to maintain your local work while helping other communities replicate your success?" Emma felt excitement building as she recognized the perfect solution, a way to expand her impact without abandoning the foundation that had made her success possible. "That sounds ideal. I'd love to explore how we could make that work." As Dr. Williams moved away to examine the library's new facilities, Emma felt Ethan's presence behind her before she turned to find him approaching with the kind of smile that suggested he'd been eavesdropping on her conversation. "State Education Department?" Ethan asked with obvious pride, his arm sliding around her waist with possessive warmth that still made her pulse quicken after months of marriage. "Consultation work," Emma confirmed, leaning into his strength as she processed the magnitude of what the afternoon had brought. "A chance to help other communities develop programs like ours while staying right here in Millbrook. The best of both worlds," Ethan said with satisfaction that spoke to his understanding of her professional needs and personal commitments. "Expanding your impact without sacrificing what we've built together." Emma looked around the library that had become the foundation of their partnership, taking in the families engaged in educational activities, the teenagers studying at computer stations that hadn't existed a year ago, the elderly residents participating in discussion groups that proved learning was a lifelong process. "We did this," Emma said with wonder that still surprised her after months of witnessing their collaborative success. "We took a dream and made it reality through partnership and mutual support." "You did this," Ethan corrected gently, his voice carrying the kind of admiration that made Emma feel valued for reasons that went far beyond professional accomplishment. "I just provided resources for vision that was already brilliant." Before Emma could argue with his characteristically modest assessment of his contributions, the library's PA system crackled to life with Mayor Henderson's voice, announcing the beginning of formal dedication ceremonies. "Ladies and gentlemen, if I could have your attention," Mayor Henderson's amplified voice carried through the renovated building, "we're ready to begin the official dedication of the Emma Walsh Community Education Center." Emma felt tears threatening as she processed the honor of having her name associated with the facility that represented her greatest professional achievement, the tangible proof that small-town dreams could become large-scale impact when supported by people who believed in their value. "Emma Walsh Community Education Center?" Emma asked Ethan with growing emotion. "The board voted unanimously," Ethan replied with obvious satisfaction. "Your name, your vision, your legacy for the next generation of Millbrook children. As they moved toward the dedication podium hand in hand, Emma realized that the choice between professional success and personal happiness had been a false dilemma all along. With the right partner, the right support, and the right community, it was possible to have both, and to use one to strengthen the other in ways that created something larger than either could achieve alone. The woman who'd settled for being taken for granted had become someone who was cherished and celebrated, while the man who'd loved from the shadows had found his voice to speak the devotion he'd been demonstrating through actions for years. Together, they'd built something beautiful from the ashes of her humiliation and his patience, proving that sometimes the most important love stories are written not in moments of passion, but in months of steady partnership and mutual support. Chapter 12. The Happy Ending. The front porch of Emma and Ethan's craftsman-style home overlooked 5 acres of carefully tended gardens that had become Millbrook's unofficial showcase for what love and patience could accomplish when combined with vision and hard work. 2 years of marriage had transformed not just the property, but the couple who'd chosen to build their life together on foundations of mutual respect, shared dreams, and the kind of love that grew stronger with each challenge they faced as partners. Emma sat curled in the porch swing that Ethan had built with his own hands, her laptop balanced on her knees as she reviewed consultation proposals from 3 different rural communities eager to replicate Millbrook's educational success. The state initiative had exceeded everyone's expectations, with Emma's hybrid model of local commitment and expert consultation proving more effective than traditional top-down policy implementation. Moreover, the professional recognition had come with personal satisfaction that went far beyond career advancement to genuine fulfillment, derived from work that matched her values and utilized her strengths. "Any interesting projects today?" Ethan asked as he emerged from the house carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing the kind of satisfied smile that suggested he'd been observing her from the kitchen windows. 3 new communities want to implement comprehensive literacy programs," Emma replied with the enthusiasm that still characterized her approach to educational innovation. "Plus a request from the state university to develop a graduate course in rural education policy." Ethan settled beside her on the swing with fluid grace, his presence immediately making the perfect evening feel even more complete. Teaching future educators how to think like Emma Walsh? Teaching future educators how to build partnerships like Emma and Ethan Walsh, Emma corrected with gentle emphasis on their collaborative approach. "The university wants me to co-teach with someone from the business school, focusing on public-private partnerships that benefit communities rather than just corporate interests." Ethan's smile carried the kind of pride that had become Emma's favorite form of affirmation. Not pride in owning something valuable, but pride in being chosen by someone whose accomplishments he genuinely admired. "Speaking of partnerships," Ethan said with careful casualness that suggested he'd been planning this conversation, "I have something to discuss with you." Emma looked up from her laptop to find Ethan studying her face with the kind of intensity that had characterized their most important conversations, his expression cycling between excitement and nervousness in ways that made her pulse quicken with anticipation. "What kind of something?" Emma asked, though her heart was already racing with possibilities she'd been hoping for but hadn't dared to voice. "The kind of something that would expand our family," Ethan said softly, his hand moving to cover hers with the reverent care that had characterized every important moment of their relationship. "The kind of something that would give us another reason to make Millbrook the best possible place to build a life." Emma felt her breath catch as she processed the implications of Ethan's words, recognizing that he was asking not just about having children, but about deepening their commitment to the community that had supported their unconventional love story. "Are you asking if I want to have a baby with you?" Emma asked directly, her heart hammering against her ribs as she prepared to voice dreams she'd been harboring for months. "I'm asking if you want to create a family with me," Ethan replied with gentle conviction. "Children who grow up knowing they're loved unconditionally, who see their parents as partners rather than adversaries, who understand that the best relationships are built on mutual support rather than taking each other for granted." Emma felt tears of joy threatening as she realized that Ethan was offering not just parenthood, but the chance to model for the next generation what healthy love actually looked like. Partnership instead of ownership, encouragement instead of control, celebration of each other's success rather than competition for attention. "Yes," Emma said without hesitation, setting aside her laptop to give this conversation the attention it deserved. "Yes, I want to have babies with you, raise children with you, show them how to build relationships based on respect and genuine care for each other's happiness." Ethan's kiss was soft, reverent, full of promises for their future and gratitude for their present. When they broke apart, both were smiling through tears of pure joy. "Any preferences about timing?" Ethan asked with the practical consideration that characterized his approach to every important decision. "Well," Emma said with a mischievous smile that made his heart skip, "it's probably too late to worry about timing at this point." Ethan went very still as he processed the implications of Emma's words, his eyes widening with wonder and delight as understanding dawned. "Are you saying—" "I'm saying that our family is already expanding," Emma confirmed with growing excitement. "I'm saying that in about 7 months, Millbrook is going to have another little Walsh to spoil and educate and love beyond measure." Ethan's shout of joy echoed across their property, carrying clearly enough to alert neighboring families that something wonderful was happening at the Walsh house. He swept Emma into his arms with careful strength, spinning her around the porch while being mindful of the precious cargo she was carrying. "How long have you known?" Ethan asked when he finally set her down, his hands immediately moving to rest against her still flat stomach with protective reverence. 2 weeks, Emma admitted. "I wanted to be sure before I told you, and I wanted to find the perfect moment to share the news." "Every moment with you is perfect," Ethan said with devastating honesty, his voice rough with emotion that spoke to the depth of his joy. "Emma, you've given me everything I never dared to hope for: love, partnership, purpose, and now a family. I don't know what I did to deserve this happiness, but I'll spend the rest of my life proving I'm worthy of it." As they sat together on their porch swing, watching the sun set over gardens they'd planted together, and planning for children who would grow up surrounded by the kind of love they'd found in each other, Emma reflected on the journey that had brought them from James's betrayal to this moment of perfect contentment. "Any regrets?" Ethan asked softly, the question he posed whenever the weight of their complicated beginning seemed to settle between them. "Only one," Emma replied with the answer that had become their private joke. "I wish I'd been brave enough to see what was right in front of me sooner so we could have had more time to build this beautiful life together." "We have forever now," Ethan said, echoing promises they'd made during darker moments when their future had seemed uncertain. "Forever to love each other, forever to raise our children, forever to prove that the best love stories are worth waiting for." As stars began appearing in the darkening sky above Millbrook, Emma and Ethan held each other on the porch swing Ethan had built with his own hands, surrounded by evidence of their partnership and anticipating the arrival of children who would grow up understanding that love was action rather than words, commitment rather than convenience, partnership rather than possession. The woman who'd been discarded for being not enough had found someone who cherished her exactly as she was, while the man who'd loved in silence had found his voice to speak devotion that had been years in the making. Their love story had begun with betrayal and revenge, but it had evolved into the kind of epic romance that proved some risks were worth taking, some waiting was worth enduring, and some love was worth fighting for regardless of how impossible it seemed at the beginning. The fake marriage that had saved Emma's pride had become the most authentic relationship either of them had ever known, and the future stretched ahead bright with possibilities they would explore together, as partners, as parents, and as proof that sometimes the most beautiful love stories are built on foundations of friendship, respect, and the choice to see someone's worth even when the rest of the world overlooks it. In Millbrook, where everyone knew everyone's business and gossip traveled faster than good news, Emma and Ethan Walsh had become the gold standard for what marriage could look like when both people chose to love actively, support genuinely, and build something beautiful from whatever materials life provided. Their children would grow up in a town where their parents were respected, not just for their individual accomplishments, but for their partnership, their commitment to community improvement, and their demonstration that the best revenge against betrayal was living so well that the betrayal became irrelevant. The end. Thank you for staying with me till the end. Where in the world are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. I will love to see how far this story travel. And if this story moved you, hit the like button and subscribe. It means the world to me.